I have to go here. I'm afraid I can't show you any more pictures about what I'm going to speak about because they don't exist. The year this time is 2026, so another time entirely. It's 13 years from now. And I've got this other longer story to tell you now. The spaceship Ares carries a multicultural group of 100 scientists and engineers, plus one stowaway, on a 9-month journey to colonize Mars. Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars, you see it here, doesn't quite begin with this scene, with the spaceship. It actually begins with the scene of the assassination some years later of the colonist charismatic leader and hints at the power struggle that follows. And these are basically, they span the 1990s, this series, these books. The book's titles, which encompass some 1,957 pages of intricate detail, because of course, in the best utopian tradition, because utopia always has to have a lot of detail, right? You have to tell the Constitution, you have to tell how the plumbing works, etc. Anyway, so lots of detail. The titles refer to the different stages in this kind of epic of Mars colonization. Red, for the lifeless geological purity of the planet as found, without a viable atmosphere to speak of. Green, for the network of verdant settlements that appear first under climate-controlled domes and later for the gradual transformation of manufactured oxygenated atmosphere along with the artificial thaw of polar ice and the consequent spread of primal vegetation genetically engineered to thrive in the harsh conditions, so the greening of Mars. And blue for the final planetary melt in a controlled deluge that produces seas and continents, along with a comprehensive Earth-like atmosphere and weather in which humans can at last live without prosthetic breathing devices or insulated suits. I recommend this, by the way. Summer reading, it's good. Anyway, this vastly accelerated centuries-long process of warming the red planet, wrapping it in oxygen and nitrogen, and propagating animal and vegetal species is called terraforming. It's the source of most, if not all, of the planet's political turmoil over the course of the 3 volumes. This is really about the politics of colonization. Terraforming is actually a staple. It's a common concept in science fiction, with some basis in kind of real or extant techniques for what is sometimes called geoengineering. Now, of the story's main characters, nearly all of them are members of this so-called first 100 who came on the spaceship, or their offspring, whose intertwined lives the narrative follows. Each character represents metonymically, or in other words, allegorizes, a distinct political shade or position relative to the terraforming process. Many of them move in and out of organized political parties that form on Mars, of which there are over 20 on Mars. And they do this either as leaders of the party or as charismatic symbols. At the 2 poles of the political debate are the fundamentalist Reds, who want at all costs to conserve the planet's barren geology in its primal state. So they're actually the Greens. Like they're like the Reds are what we would call the Greens because they like nature. They just want to keep it red. And the developmentalist Greens, they're the who advocate viriditas, or the inexorable proliferation of life. So the Greens are the developers. They're the ones who want to develop Mars in one way or the other. And these are the poles of this very intricate spectrum of political parties and so on that form. Both of these have quasi-theological dimensions. The most extreme Reds who are figured in a renegade. There's one geologist figure who is a kind of their leader. Practice a monastic asceticism devoted to the primal beauty of the planet's barren surface. So they're kind of worshipping, in effect, the beauty of Mars as found, while the more devout Greens hew to a cult of viriditas, and they're led by a guru-like bioengineer. So, all right, now we're going to get to our semiotic squares. I'm not going to show you any, but you saw them earlier, so you'll remember. Already here we have a myriad of this, not that dialectical oppositions organizing the narratives. These include nested movements between the secular and the religious, between the rational and the irrational, between pure and applied science, between male and female, and even, these are all elements in the story and the kind of the allegories that overlay allegories, and even a somewhat fudged or ambiguous dialectic between capitalism and communism. Each axis in this multidimensional matrix brings its own subplots and contradictions, beginning with the ambiguous political valence, as I just said, of the colors red and green themselves. So they sort of switch sides. And this, by the way, I have to say this in Belgrade, despite Robinson's debt to Alexander Bogdanov's Red Star of 1908. So the book, Red Mars, particularly refers to Red Star, a classic of Soviet, really pre-Soviet science fiction. But the trilogy's dialectic is incomplete without the Mars-Earth axis itself, materialized in the great space elevator. So you have Mars and Earth form a kind of axis, and there's this space elevator that's installed on Mars at which space shuttles dock in orbit to discharge their loads. Basically, they put it above the atmosphere, so you can dock the shuttle in order to ease the energy demands of interplanetary travel that's imposed by gravity or an atmospheric friction. So you're in gravity-free space at the top of the elevator. It's all very realistic, by the way. Now, before that is the entire, so you have this space elevator, but eventually this whole structure winds up wrapped twice around the planet, around Mars, following an act of revolutionary sabotage that takes it down and reorients the narrative towards a violently contested future. So the rebels kind of take out the space elevator, it falls down, it wraps itself twice, because it's really long, right? Twice around the planet. It's made of nanocarbons and anyway. So anyway, I feel somewhat comfortable in referring to the dialectical structure of this popular science fiction series. And now we, again, enter another meta-dialogue with talks. Because, for one thing, its author, Kim Stanley Robinson, holds a PhD in English from the University of California at San Diego. And so he's well-schooled in dialectical thought. His doctoral thesis, which he completed in 1982, analyzed the novels of Philip K. Dick. And his thesis advisor was none other than the Marxian literary theorist, Frederick Jameson. So this is basically what happens, and these were all written after Jameson's book on postmodern. So, okay, this is Utopia. Actually, Robinson, the author, credits Jameson with introducing him to Marxism and to literary theory. So you have this popular science fiction that embeds and inscribes the semiotic squares, the dialectics, and the problem of utopia that we've already heard that Jameson reformulates. For his part, Jameson has also written about Robinson's work. He's written about these books, most notably in the concluding chapter of his long volume, Archaeologies of the Future, The Desire Called Utopia and Other Science Fictions of 2005. The title of that chapter, the Jameson chapter that's about the books, which was first published in 2000, is, quote, "If I find one good city, I'll spare the man. Realism and Utopia in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy." So we sort of have it all here in these books. The subtitle, Realism and Utopia, refers to a particular type of realism that Jameson finds in Robinson's novels. So he's describing these as realist novels at some level. So for him, this realism is exemplified by one of the trilogy's central characters, who is a problem-solving scientific polymath, for whom, as Jameson puts it, quote, "external reality organizes itself into a problem, scientific problem, to which science responds." At some level, and a lot of, science fiction does this all the time. It fills the pages with scientific responses to new problems that show up under the new conditions. At some level, at some point, the scientific solution or explanation, however, encounters a limit, thus presenting what Jameson calls a resistance. Scientific knowledge emerges dialectically out of this resistance, while remaining ontologically bounded by what Robinson's scientist hero calls the great unexplainable. So Mars is still filled with great unexplainables for, science circa 2026. This obdurate resistance of reality to comprehensive explanation is both generative and secular. It's not just some mystical idea that we can't explain nature. It's actually generative and secular. Following the more conventional arc of descriptive literary realisms, which, as in architecture, are commonly said to have been superseded by abstract reflexive modernism, this resistance is gradually shown, according to Jameson, to be a novelistic conceit, a kind of trick. It's a fiction comparable to the impenetrable puzzle erected at the outset of a mystery novel, only to be solved by the novel's end. In other words, all of this descriptive, the realist detail, is like what happens at the beginning, or let's say, of a Sherlock Holmes story, where you know it's going to be solved. You know that science will penetrate this and figure it out. And that's the conceit. The literary conceit is the knowledge that the puzzle will be solved. And that's the conceit of realism, according to James. Modernism turns the tables on all of this by examining reflexively how it's all produced. In the process upends narrative, figuration, and representation. However, even at its most dogmatic, a modernist and eventually postmodernist awareness of the constructedness, the kind of trickery of realist narratives, and ultimately of scientific facts, does not automatically cancel or relativize the underlying reality, as simplistic critiques of post-structuralist theory would have it. Instead, this kind of awareness of the constructedness of the realist text, it raises that reality to the second degree. As Jameson puts it, still referring indirectly to the pages and pages of scientific and parascientific description that are packed into the Mars trilogy, quote, behind the theory of social construction, therefore, lies praxis and human production itself, which makes a mockery of realism's staged mystery stories. In other words, Mars is a mirror. It's a way, really, just of understanding what one is doing back on Earth. Terraforming in this formulation is a dialectical procedure by which both a particular a priori reality, such as Martian geology, and its potential human constructions, the terraforming, come into view. Both of these come into view, rather than the simple replacement of one order of being, primal geological red with another biological cultural green. Both of these come into view at once. To this dialectic, Jameson also adds the Earth-Mars axis. In his reading, and I'm going to eventually tell you what I think is wrong with Jameson's reading of his own student, in his reading, that axis secures the properly utopian character of Robinson's series as the dystopia of the increasingly more dire conditions on Earth and the resulting interplanetary migration put increased pressure on the fragile Martian ecosystem. The space elevator, its destruction, replacement, and eventual multiplication, together with the 54.6 million kilometers that separate the two planetary orbits, and the variety of techno-social arrangements that are devised in the story to span the distance, is the structural equivalent of the geo-engineered trench separating the island of Utopia from the mainland in Thomas More. All right, so you always have to have that gap, the distance. And that's always a piece of technology. An asymmetrical back and forth runs between a still recognizable Earth, right? So you have Earth that's dystopic basically, ruled by meta-national corporations and weak states and subject to extreme forms of global warming and overpopulation, and then following a second revolution, an agonistically democratic and pluralistic Mars. So you have Earth is basically a disaster area, and Mars is this new democratic planet. That's the axis. The literal and figurative distance from Earth elicits for Jameson the cognitive estrangement that's necessary to achieve on Mars what he calls a polyphonic utopianism, or a struggle between a whole range of utopian alternatives, quote, about which the trilogy deliberately fails to conclude. You have every possible species of utopia supposedly represented on Mars in this story, all in contrast to the catastrophe back on Earth. Now, Jameson concludes by naming the mysterious abolition of money. This is a very frequent, common theme in utopian discourse. He says basically that the abolition of money is the narrative's most basic and unexplained and therefore overdetermined utopian premise. In other words, they don't really explain how on Mars they get rid of money, but somehow they magically get rid of money, more or less. And they have another economic system that's also somewhat mysterious. However, neither Jameson nor Robinson take up what I think may be actually the trilogy's more fundamental epistemological problem. So this is what I think is, as it were, overdetermined by Jamieson's own reading, and it's also overdetermined about the novel's sort of internal dialectic. Among its tour de force conceits, described in exhaustive parascientific detail, these are all the kind of layers of realism that are built into this story. They described in exhaustive detail are the exploitation of the planet's geology and hydrology, the epic harnessing of solar energy with a giant space mirror, the mining of satellites, the chemical construction of an atmosphere, and even the evolution of a new quasi-species of taller, more agile humans in the diminished Martian gravity. All of these are explained. However, more mysterious even than the abolition of money is the existence of something that's called, in the story, the gerontological treatments, or merely the treatments in short. These treatments, which have to be re-administered every few decades, virtually eliminate disease and prolong human life by an unknown extent, which is thought to be hundreds or even thousands of years. Two of the original Mars scientist colonists were instrumental in their development and implementation. From the outset of the story, the longevity treatments are the basis for a socioeconomic apartheid that rebounds racially, gradually constructing two competing categories of humans. On Earth, access to the treatments requires either considerable private means, wealth, membership in metanational corporate life, which provide them as a sort of employee benefit. If you work for a corporation, you get the treatment. Or status as a Mars colonist. All Mars colonists are treated. Anyone without such access is condemned to live entirely outside the sphere in which the trilogy's principal contest between red and green utopia occurs. So in other words, the untreated populations live outside the dialectic entirely. So Robinson portrays the main consequences of this apartheid as ecological, in that vastly increased longevity, even for a minority of Earth's population, leads quickly to a massive population explosion and hence political pressure to increase Mars migration quotas, particularly from countries like India and China and their corporate patrons. These migrations, in turn, threaten the Martian ecology, an effect that generates profound political struggle on Mars and is opposed with particular vehemence by the Red Planet's conservationist faction, the Reds. So they want to limit migration. In this sense, the Earth-Mars axis poses the housing question at the planetary scale of mass migration, but rapidly displaces it onto an ecological plane. Right? It becomes an ecological problem, not a question of housing. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the situation becomes critical when a subterranean volcanic eruption fractures and melts the West Antarctic ice cap, flooding coastal cities and dramatically accelerating the greenhouse effect, resulting in full-scale planetary warming. However, less remarked by either the student Robinson or the teacher Jamieson are the more immediate consequences of this apartheid that I mentioned, and in particular the biomedical and hence biopolitical divisions among classes and other earthly groupings that it engenders. The starkest division, separating those who have received the treatments from those who have not, potentially inflicts more sustained physical damage than do the divisions separating, for example, inland populations from coastal ones after the deluge, or indeed Earth from Mars. In this respect, the Mars trilogy projects, among other things, a perverse biopolitical utopia based on a distinction between the radically extended species being of those who might live 1,000 years and therefore have a debate like what the future should look like, and the radically attenuated or limited species being of those who will not, because they have not received these treatments. Nor is lifespan the sole consequence of the new order, for the biomedical apartheid incites a whole range of underdescribed but still noticeable conflicts. Countries and metanational managers face intense pressure from below to address their underserved populations, who include both the ageless generations that are now piling up in overcrowded cities and towns and the lumpen proletariat of the untreated, ever present but just over the horizon, not really part of the story. But when revolution actually occurs in the story, it occurs on Mars, not on Earth. And not as a result of these biopolitical conflicts, but ostensibly at least as a separatist fight over ecological custody of the planet. So it's about ecology and its resources that devolves into a kind of civil war amongst the two groups, the Reds and the Greens, who have already benefited, both of these groups have already benefited from the longevity treatments and are therefore able to participate in the utopian project in the first place. Right? So that's the point. The point is that this utopian contest is itself constructed on the basis of another division that's unarticulated in the sort of theoretical subtext of the story. In this sense, the earthly biopolitical conflict over access to treatments inverts the terms of the Martian ecological conflict of development versus conservation. On Earth, those who remain closest, medically speaking, to the biological state of nature, call it bare life if you'd like, are at risk of eventually being classified as subhuman in relationship to those who have had full access to the longevity treatments. What is most natural is therefore most precarious. Those who are untreated, who are not subject to the biomedical transformation, the most precarious. While on Mars, the conservationist, naturalist imperative, the kind of nature worship, is repeatedly invoked as a moral ideal by those who have already been treated by this artificial new species. And marked most strikingly by the changing horizontal stratum that's at the top, at the crest of the new atmosphere that they're building, below which is green construction, and above which you still see the red landscape at the top of the clouds, basically, in Mars. So that's the dialectic on Mars, but the problem of treated versus untreated is completely absent from the picture. In short, the entire, quite realistic in the literary sense, but also quite artificial dialectic of red conservationist utopias and green developmentalist ones, these are familiar sort of dynamics, depends on the prior biopolitical division of the human population into two species. Those who have access to the longevity treatment and those who do not. The first treated group participates in the contradictions of utopian thought. They're part of the semiotic square, along the doubled-up Earth-Mars red-green axes. The second, untreated group, does not, by virtue of having been written out of the equation and indeed out of the story entirely. Just as the abolition of money is described but not fully accounted for in the series, the eventual erasure of this divide, with the full Terran population, full earthly population gradually gaining access to the treatments, is noted, but eventually everybody gets them, but it's not explained how, because there's a basic antagonism structurally that is not explained how that's overcome. Is this the final triumph of the realist utopia, in which problem-solving scientific enterprise finally domesticates obdurate nature, finally even the nature of life itself? Is this finally, we all become, as it were, immortal, and transcends the resistance of the political with its solutions? Or is it the opposite, the triumph of the real, politics in the form of radical exclusion, over even the most dialectically uncompromising plural and polyphonic utopia? Now, by real here, I do not mean natural. I mean prior, pre-existing, in the sense of the biomedical, biopolitical apartheid that I've been describing, that pre-exists and invisibly supports the manifest political content of Robinson's 3 books. What's real about it is not the scientific or biological plausibility of these gerontological treatments, or even the way in which these mimic or allegorize similar biopolitical divisions among actually existing Earthlings. As, for example, when Robinson, talking about how one Martian is visiting the island of Crete, says, well, the rest of Earth, however, was Calcutta. So, you have these beautiful touristic spots, but then you have Calcutta. It's not just that. What's real about the biomedical apartheid in the story is the way in which it circumscribes or limits the political allegory of the Mars trilogy. The apartheid is not itself dialectical in any meaningful way. It cannot be inscribed into the semiotic squares. It marks an a priori horizon, internal to the narrative, yet concealed by it, which make the dialectics of utopia and realism possible in the first place. So it's the precondition for the dialectic. Elsewhere, Jameson has suggestively argued that the true vocation of utopian thought is not to think utopia, but to reveal its very unthinkability under present conditions. The question is therefore not simply what must change, but rather what must change so that change will be thinkable. Hence, the utopian question posed perhaps unconsciously by the Mars trilogy, not so much the conscious red versus green, is not red or green. It is, how could this be? How could this indeterminate dialectical construction be built on another, even more stark reality that passes nearly unnoticed by the dialectic. Which returns us, finally, to where I began, and we'll conclude, with Voyager's exit from the heliosphere. Among the most fantastical, least realist sections of the Mars trilogy, the least convincing, if you like, if any of it is convincing, are those that are described in the third book, Blue Mars, which describe the further colonization of the outer solar system. So actually what happens is then Martians, having succeeded on Mars, go on to the rest of the solar system. So they follow Voyager, There, Mars's original pluralism is projected onto the diverse characteristics that are imposed on various terraforming missions by the specific geological, meteorological, and atmospheric conditions of the other planets and their satellites, and in the myriad technological, cultural, and political economic responses to these conditions. So you can imagine, in every possible situation is hinted at, like what would happen if you went on this planet, or that planet, or this moon, or that moon. So among, this is my favorite one anyway, among the most architecturally innovative is a super studio-like continuous monument that is known as the Terminator, which glides slowly along tracks. This is a beautiful thing to imagine. So you have this city that glides slowly along tracks that wrap entirely around Mercury's equator. Its imperceptible, steady movement is propelled by the differential expansion of the tracks. This is an example of the kind of exaggerated realism typical of science fiction. You have to explain. You have this moving city. How does the city move? Because the tracks just slightly expand as the planet rotates, and that portion of the tracks is exposed to the sun, to the heat of the sun. Expanding the tracks and pushing it along slowly, slowly, slowly. And hence keeping this city just beyond the horizon in permanent protective shadow, because of course it's Mercury, right? So we have to stay out of the sun. Other sites include Jupiter's asteroid belt, which now contains mines and settlements carved into individual asteroids, as well as the 4 big Jovian moons known as the Galileans, Callisto, Ganymede, Io, and Europa. And of course this is all part of Voyager's kind of program. All with massive illumination projects to compensate for the minimal direct sunlight they receive. Still another site is the restless settler colony on Oberon, one of Uranus's moons, who already have their sights set on Pluto and its largest satellite, Charon. So they're going all the way out to the edge. Now, improbable as it may seem, and in a literary manner, as you can imagine, that has become somewhat forced with this kind of, it really gets to be a bit much after a while, all of this detail. By the conclusion of the third book, or maybe it's just the length of the thing, by the conclusion of the third book, the entire solar system has become to Mars what Mars had been to Earth, a colonial frontier in which are reflected all of the aspirations, conflicts, and ideological struggles of the home planet, kind of writ large in the solar system. Every possible political party, every cult, every club, every grouping is out there somewhere. Now, however, these are no longer spread in microcosm in small settlements across the Martian landscape. They're spread in macrocosm across the solar system itself. But this is where the reality of Voyager 1, having crossed the imagined frontier and left to hurtle through the interstellar void, eclipses the utopianism of the Mars trilogy. As a scientific probe, its weakening signals continue to record human encounter with the obdurate matter of the universe, in a fashion as realist, in fact as real, as any of Robinson's fictional scientist heroes could have imagined. But its own utopian lesson does not lie in the distant promise of one day populating that frontier with human settlements, which once and for all would lay out for inspection all of the conflicts and contradictions of earthly existence and therefore play out the dialectic yet again, as implied in the Mars trilogy. Nor does it lie, its utopian lesson, nor does that lie in the promise of yet farther horizons. Its utopianism, which is also its realism, lies in what it conceals here on Earth, rather than what it reveals in the skies, namely the horizons of thought. These horizons encompass the 122 astronomical units that now separate us from Voyager. All of human history is contained in that distance, as are the a priori conditions of our existence. Among those conditions is the inability to see simultaneously the starry skies and the ground on which we stand. Both are real, but the truly utopian thought recognizes that the question of how to inhabit the skies is preceded by the question of how to inhabit the earth, rather than alternative to it. Utopia, then, is a down-to-earth thought, as mundane and unexciting as reopening the housing question. It's here that the real horizons lie. Thank you.